I mean, it depends on what you think. What's up, guys? I love Hunter here, and we're going to do a breakdown / discussion on whether or not Jacob's Ladder did enough. Like the technique specifically, Jacob's Ladder, whether it did enough. We're going to talk about Hana in her own separate video, and that video is going to be much longer. That video's gonna be king, especially considering I'm like 99.9% sure. I was 99.9% sure before we were not gonna see this character again, but now I just need to. I'm gonna lay my bets down. There's a reason she got knocked out, laid out, and splayed out. I think we're done with the character. I think we're done with the technique. So I'll make that Hana video soon enough. I still didn't make that Yuki video. Actually, no, I did make the Yuki video. But I need to make another Yuki video because now I gotta go back to glazing / anti-glaze. But with that being the case, let's not waste any more time and let's hop right into the discussion. Heading me, are you ready? 3, 2, 1, go. What's up, guys? That guy with a pencil here. Fun fact, I do happen to have it on me and keep it on me at all times. And another fun fact, Jacob's Ladder was successful in its intended purpose twice out of the 1 to 4 times it was used. It was successful in its purpose 50% of the time. And that's failing. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not sure. My education system, if you had a 50% on your test, you failed. If you had anything less than, like, I think a 65% on your test, you failed. And while a coin toss is a coin toss, I understand that, ultimately, that's still failure. So, Jacob's Ladder, as a technique, as a wrap-up, as a finisher, whatever you would like to call it, it looks bad on a numbers front. Going 50-50, unless in very specific contexts, is not preferable. And let's go into context on what the 50-50s were. For the most recent one, the one that has Jacob's Ladder as a technique kind of under discussion as a whole, is the most recent variation of it in 264, where it did basically nothing. Like, don't get me wrong, Gege does emphasize the fact that Sukuna is in fact burning. You see a little bit of pieces of him coming off, and later on we do get to see that while Todo himself never ended up burning because he seemingly enough was never caught in the light, Yuji Todori was also burning. But like, remember what this was meant to do. At the end of 263, everybody in their mama was tweaking and geeking for one particular reason. Everybody in their mama thought, oh, this the finisher. This the route. This is the big bad move, because this wasn't no easy coming. This wasn't no smooth sliding. This was Todo Aoi deciding to pull out his Joker card, something that Yudora Kotsu asked Angel to come in and do. Angel / Hana, he was like, hey, no matter what, I'm a low-key need you to pull up at the last second. I ain't even asking you to box. I'm just asking you to show up and show out. So 263 ended. We went on a week break on something this big and this hefty. This Jacob's Ladder was supposed to go crazy. The whole community was up in a tizzy because this seemed big, bad, and crazy. And of course, we had the previous expectation of one of the previous uses of Jacob's Ladder that we're going to talk about later. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, despite having a whole back half of a chapter dedicated to it and a whole, realistically, realize this is going to be crazy. This is likely the last Boogie Woogie in the entire series. Like before, I thought the last Boogie Woogie in the entire series was the one he did with Mahito way back when. But no, this definitively is likely the last Boogie Woogie in the entire series. Halfway because the series is ending, and the other half because Todo doesn't have a hand anymore. It was done. It was to the point where Todo couldn't even Boogie Woogie in 264 when he likely would have liked to have used the technique, mainly because he didn't have a hand. Or a hand substitute. He very specifically had to leap. Like, you see him flat out leap off the building in order to defend Hana. So Jacob's Ladder, very, very whack, considering it had so much hype and build-up for this end of 263, only for it to come out and leave Sukuna looking nowhere near as crispy as he did before, when Sukuna is indefinitively one of his weakest states. Of course, he lands a Black Flash on Todo. He landed a Black Flash on Todo previously in the last chapter. Obviously, Sukuna's output was starting to get back up. But remember how close this Sukuna was, soul-wise, to being spread apart. Just straight, dive in his cheeks, spread them open. It was to the point where Suguna believes that all it would take is about one more hit. Even after getting his RCT back, he's like, hey, all I need to do is wait for my technique to recover and hold out. I do not need to directly engage with this man. I just can't get hit. And he basically was doing that. That's why ultimately he was confident. He was good, and then he got hit by the domain expansion. But Jacob's Ladder, in spite of being a technique that is specifically meant to extinguish people like Suguna, and Suguna being in one of the weakest soul connection states that we've seen him in, it did nothing. Other than toast Yuji a little bit, and toast Suguna a little bit. And that's not that good. Not that good, to say the very least. And unfortunately, if we start going to the other instances of Jacob's Ladder, it actually does get a little bit better. If we're going back to the second most previous instance of Jacob's Ladder, technically, and I mean technically, it did do its job. Remember, specifically, Jacob's Ladder is used by Yuta Kotsu back in 251 in order to toast Sukuna up a little bit. He goes from looking mostly chilled to a bit deep fried by the time he gets hit by Jacob's Ladder, and Yuta very specifically turns Jacob's Ladder off in order for Yuji to, boom, get in there and get in contact with Fushiguro. And technically, this is the other one purpose where I say Jacob's Ladder did function properly, in the sense that it opened the door for Yuji. Remember, that was the whole original plan. In fact, as the chapter itself states, Itadori and Akotsu's calculations weren't wrong about the structure of the soul. But Megami himself wasn't going along with it. So technically, this is a Jacob's Ladder dub, but it's not a Jacob's Ladder dub in the macro sense, if you know what I'm talking about. Jacob's Ladder was, once again, meant to be a very hyped up, very dangerous, very next level finisher that Sukuna himself was afraid of, to the point where he didn't even want to risk it at first. He was just going to hollow wicker basket the entire thing, but he was forced to just because of the pressure that Yuji and Yuta were putting on him. But ultimately, Jacob's Ladder just didn't end up doing enough. It lightly crisped him, it led to an arm getting torn off, and then he bisected Yuta anyway. Now leaving Yuta in a situation where he's either going to perish or go into Gojo. And he decided to go into Gojo, and now as Gojo, he's going to perish. So, ultimately, Jacob's Ladder, it worked, as in it opened the door, but on a macro narrative sense, it didn't work. On a micro level, it worked, which is why I'll give it another point, but technically, it still didn't work. And that's not looking too good on the macro sense, but we'll try to inch this a dub. And the main reason I'm going to inch this a dub is because, going back to the first instance of Jacob's Ladder, it's kind of a... This is once again a line between the technique and the individual, and how much these two clash. Because technically, Jacob's Ladder wasn't just working, it was super effective. Like, the moment Sukuna gets hit by Jacob's Ladder, he's looking like this. Gege had to actively go back in the redraw. This is from the official manga release that was on Viz. Gege had to go back in the volume redraws and redraw this to make Sukuna look more dignified and less atomized, because Jacob's Ladder was genuinely cooking that man. So it technically worked properly. But once again, calling back to the character, it ended up fumbling a bit, and Hana ended up getting, well, nibbled on. So overall, Jacob's Ladder, to some degree, seems like a technique that does function. In all instances, it's not like Jacob's Ladder itself fails to activate. It's not like it fails to admittedly, in 264, it did fail to immediately do what it was meant to do. But still, the other two instances, it was working on Sukuna initially. When Megano was first being born, it was working. Quite well, in fact. When used by Yuta Kotsu, they were correct. They made the correct assumptions about the soul and how the technique would interact with it. It did work. But on the third scale, it didn't work. So Jacob's Ladder is looking pretty rough, because it technically works, but it fails. And it works, but it fails. Then last time, it doesn't work, but technically it does work because it activates, but it fails because the output's lower. And Sukuna is still super duper strong, and ultimately Hana just isn't enough. As Sukuna very clearly points out in 264, it comes down to a vessel issue. It comes down to the fact that, yeah, Jacob's Ladder is an extremely powerful, extremely potent technique in the right hands. But ultimately, Hana's the furthest thing from a Jujutsu sorcerer. While everyone else may have trained and upped their physicals, it's noted by Sukuna specifically, they're coexisting within that body. You're nothing but a strong technique in a weak shell. Losing one of their arms make that fact all the more true. They are unable to garner the same output they did back then. So, yeah. It's just a case of Hana being a little bit worse. Not the technique itself. But even then, the technique itself is worse because of Hana, and thusly this still counts as a showing of the technique, considering this is Jacob's Ladder. So, in spite of what glazing you could try to give to Jacob's Ladder, it seems like it fails on every front. It didn't do enough. It never worked, or at least didn't work permanently. It led to a temporary stopgap initially against Sukuna, all the way back in 213. It led to another temporary stopgap against Sukuna, all the way in 251. And it didn't even act as a temporary stopgap the last time. So, why am I still about to say that the technique did its job narratively pretty much perfectly? Well, it comes down to arguably the most important use of it. No, inarguably the most important use of it. The reason why the technique was introduced in the first place. Arguably the reason why the character was introduced in the first place. Once again, I'm going to make a separate Hana video so I can go more in depth about that. Once again, it's going to be very, very long. I'm going to be talking in depth about Hana on both the good, the bad, the ugly, and somewhere in between. But with that being the case, remember what Hana was initially introduced for? What Angel was initially introduced for, what the whole point of Jacob's Ladder originally was. Let's be real. It wasn't to defeat Sukuna. It sounds like it should be. In fact, you can go check my ranking of the Cursed Techniques video. That thing's like 2 hours long. I put Hana's technique in the top of the top. Peak of the verse. Spoilers for that video, I guess. But still, it's clearly a very powerful technique in concept and somewhat in execution. If the vessel is properly formed, or the original user is wielding it and they don't turn at all, it's clearly very, very powerful, very, very effective, even on a character as mighty as Sukuna, who's shown numerous times, many ways, shapes, and forms, that ultimately, if your technique is even at all effective on him, you're clearly some type of caliber. So, with that being the case, it sounds strange to say it wasn't introduced to defeat Sukuna, right? It's an extremely powerful technique that's effective on Sukuna. What do you mean it's not meant to defeat Sukuna? It was meant to free Gojo. That's what the technique was introduced for. That's what Hana was introduced for. Remember? All the way back when Hana was initially introduced, the main point was not to defeat Sukuna, was not to act as an out against Sukuna, none of that. It wasn't even meant to defeat Big Jaku. No, it was meant to free this man. That was its narrative role. All the extra stuff, ending up in Yuda's kit, being used by Hana on Meguna, all the way to being used by Hana again on Sukuna, Meguna, in 264, all of that is technically bonus. Because the original narrative purpose was to free Satoru Gojo, so he could fight Ryo and Sukuna. And it did that. Did it very well, in fact. Now, did Satoru Gojo beat Sukuna? No. He didn't. But in terms of narrative purpose, Jacob's Ladder had one job and it did it. Remember, the way Jacob's Ladder was initially introduced wasn't even meant to be used on incarnated sorcerers. In fact, we find that out after the fact. The main reason Tengen even brings up the whole concept of Angel as a character is in order to negate cursed techniques. And the prison realm was a cursed technique that Angel negated. And Jacob's Ladder negated. So legally speaking, it did its job. And it did it well. The fact that none of the bonuses worked, womp womp. Unfortunate, not what it was introduced for. Not what it was going to do. And realistically, the reason I still say it works, and despite being realistically 50-50 successful, and realistically 1 out of 4 successful, considering all the other times it did work, it didn't really work in the macro sense, I'll be real with you. Even though those not working in the macro sense because of characters, level with me. Would you have been happy if Hana defeated Sukuna in 213? Like just on a narrative writing, would you have been happy? Would you have been satisfied? If Sukuna, who at the time, hey, I was low-key leaning to Kenjaku being the main villain, but hey, at the bare minimum, a major antagonist at the time of the release of 213, would you have been happy if he had just been hard wiped? I know, at the time, we thought there were 4 more fingers out and about, or 5 more fingers. We thought this was a 15 finger. We didn't know about the finger hidden in Yuji, thus leading this to be a 16 finger Meguna. But still, would you have been happy if JJK had just ended here? Because, let's be real, Sukuna falls here, then what is Kenjaku doing when Gojo gets released? Nothing other than getting perished. Getting perished? That doesn't even make sense. Nothing other than perishing. Or it will make nothing other than perishing. The whole Shinjuku Showdown does not happen. However you feel about the Shinjuku Showdown, however you feel about how it's going to end, regardless, I think we can all come to the common consensus that at the end of the day, we didn't want Hana to do it. We wanted Hana to maybe help. We did not want Hana to defeat Sukuna. Same case for when it was used in 251. Ultimately, while it would have been a cool, crazy twist for Yuta Kosa to be like, he slaughtered my sensei. I don't even know this Megami kid that well. Why am I even bothering trying to say? And he just doesn't turn it off. And he just let Sukuna keep getting cooked in Jacob's ladder. If we just let that happen. And Sukuna actually perished here. And Yuji was like, dude, what the heck? I was trying to save Megami. And Yuta admittedly did the logical thing. I was like, well, I thought about it realistically. And honestly, the longer we let this dude live, on the possibility of a chance of saving one dude after he's already slaughtered like 3, I think the win-loss ratio is worth it. If Yuta had done that, I think the Yuta fans would be happy, because then Yuta would have gotten a slaughter on Sukuna. But, like, even the Yuta fans would probably be a little bit like, because it wouldn't feel right? Like it just wouldn't feel. That's the thing. It's all about vibes. I'll admit, it's all about vibes and narrative character cohesiveness. Narrative character cohesiveness. I don't know what I was trying to say initially, but that's what this is all about. Sure, Jacob's Ladder failed at beating Sukuna, but it fulfilled what it was introduced to do, and it didn't it somewhat killed the vibe, because 263 hypes it up a whole bunch, and even Sukuna's looking up like, oh, sweet mother of... Like he looks like it's meant to do much, and it does get a bunch of hype, and that does somewhat kill the vibes, but let's be real. There are more important and bigger and badder and dangerous and crazier things that we're talking about by the time of 264's end. Sure, at first, the vibes are kind of wacky. They're kind of silly. They're a little bit goofy. The fact that everybody in their mama was joking about Sukuna literally climbing Jacob's ladder, and he actually did it. I know I was laughing. I know other people were laughing, and a lot of people were annoyed. But hey, it'd be like that when it be like that sometimes. But obviously, Gege knew that was going to happen, and that's why they ended 264 the way they did with Yuji Todori's domain expansion. Once again, I ask you, how satisfied would you have been if this was actually Sukuna's end? If this Jacob's Ladder popped out like the 213 Jacob's Ladder and just deleted Sukuna, hard extinguished that bad boy. Gege could have just used the explanation that was established. Sukuna was already on the verge of being split from Megami. This technique that was meant to purify him initially, that nearly worked all the way back in 213, when restored and properly used against the Sukuna who's much, much more soul destabilized, ended up properly erasing him. Yuji Todori, Todo Aoi, and Hanakurusu all hit the gritty on Sukuna's body. Or Megami's body, as he's crying tears and hurls up fingers. And then the fingers get erased. Would you have been satisfied? Would you have been? Level with me. Be honest. Yeah, you wouldn't have, right? Because it wouldn't have made sense. Narratively. Not on a character level. Because it's Yuji Todori's villain. Not Hana's villain. And Hana, if we're talking about it. And Jacob's Ladder, if we're talking about it. In terms of narrative importance, are like C tiers. If we're being real. So, if anything, this is going to sound absolutely stupid, crazy, and backwards, but if anything, I'd say Jacob's Ladder is better because it failed. Because it didn't work, except for its initial use on the thing that we needed it for, aka the prison realm, it actively makes the narrative better. This is going to sound so crazy, but what did Sukuna climbing Jacob's Ladder do? What did this moment do in your head? Other than after the immediate reaction of, this is straight nonsense, what is this man made out of? After we got the explanation, and we see Sukuna straight up climbing through it after punching rocks up and going crazy to immediately black flash Todo, what did it do? Oh yeah, it reminded us, for maybe the final time, or maybe the penultimate time, that Sukuna is the strongest sorcerer. He's built for this, he understands the system, and he knows how to react to certain things. That's what the whole narrative's been building to. Heck, that's what the whole Battle of Satoru Gojo was meant to tell us. That Sukuna is the strongest, and ultimately you cannot expect to defeat him in conventional, easy, simple ways. Hey, what did it tell us all the way back in 251? Oh yeah, that Sukuna, he's mighty, the strongest. He can't be taken out as easily by something like that, and also that Megami Fushiguro is specifically a cause that cannot be saved easily. They may have planned perfectly about the nature of souls, but ultimately they did not plan perfectly around Megami Fushiguro. Thusly, Jacob's Ladder was not the key. An external perfect power was not the key. All the way back in 213, juicy, scrumdiddlyumptious, toasting that man on both sides. I know if you slapped a bit of butter on him, he'd be delicious. In the end, reducing him down to his basic form, Ryomen Sukuna was not going to fall to a technique that had yet to prove its initial narrative purpose. And also, once again, Hana and by proxy the technique are just not that important. And while they do have ties to Sukuna's through Angel and Megami, it simply was not going to work. And once again, this shows off another aspect of Sukuna, his cunning, his willingness, and his ability to manipulate and play the game of sorcery. All that's good. All that feeds back into Sukuna being the strongest, the smartest, the most dangerous, the most devious, the most almighty, and also Megami's tragedy. All that's important for the general narrative of JJK. And feeds backwards into more important characters, despite Hana, the technique, and Angel not being that important in the grand scheme of things. That's actually good. That's how I would write side characters. It seems blasphemous, because we're talking about failures leading to success on a writing level. But think about it. All this does is add to Sukuna's legacy. It sounds so crazy. But, like, I saw someone lay it out, clearly in plain. If you look at a stats sheet, or not a stats sheet, a stats spread of what everything that Sukuna's tanked and recovered from throughout the Shinjuku Showdown, smacking another Jacob's Ladder on top of that is nice, even if it was a nerfed one. Sukuna being swole, there's no doubt that this man was undeniably powerful. Final villain material, no doubt about it. And Angel helped that. Angel helped show that off. There's no doubt that ultimately no one could save Megami but Yuji Todori. Angel helped with that. The technique helped with that. All of that works because of Jacob's Ladder's failure, and of course, the whole scenario where Sukuna was even in a position where he could lose. The whole scenario only works because in the end, it was Hanakurusu, the Angel, and Jacob's Ladder that freed Satoru Gojo for his battle with Ryomen Sukuna, which weakened him enough that we could actually be in a position where the domain expansion of Yuji Itadori would actively do something. Without Jacob's Ladder, without Hana, without Angel, this battle would have never happened. And, of course, with it not happening, Sukuna would have raffle-stomped the entire cast even easier than he was raffle-stomping the entire cast. So Jacob's Ladder did his job. It did enough. In fact, it did more than enough. Not only did it serve its initial narrative purpose of freeing Satoru Gojo to battle Ryomen Sukuna, which is what we initially needed it for, even if we didn't know that we were going to be battling Ryomen Sukuna at the time of freeing Gojo. Freeing Gojo was the main thing it was made for, so it fulfilled its initial narrative purpose, and then succeeded in highlighting other character aspects and narrative functions by showing the power of Sukuna, the cunning of Sukuna, the strength of Sukuna. It's power and strength are the same thing, and also his mindset and how he reacts to certain things, and just building his hype. All of that was done by Jacob's Ladder. So in my honest opinion, laying the gauntlet down, keeping it technique focused, and not talking too much about the character, Jacob's Ladder served its purpose, and it served it well. Is it embarrassing that a technique that turns off techniques ended up being this weak? Yeah, a little bit. Typically techniques of this caliber are very, very strong in their respective universes. Like, typically Broken Strong, I'm thinking of the Demon King's Power from Seven Deadly Sins. I'm thinking of Anti-Magic from Black Clover. I'm thinking of the Truth-Seeking Orbs from Naruto. Like, yeah, of course, techniques that turn off other techniques are meant to be a bit more broken. But, if anything, this just fits into the narrative of JJK even further, on a meta-narrative level, as JJK is initially subversive, from its very start all the way to its very end, so it makes sense that a technique that seems so powerful in concept would ultimately fall flat, in a narrative that has so much more to do with other characters, other abilities, and other backgrounds. But, in the end, that's what I think. Please what you guys think in the comment section down below. Do you think in spite of my talk about narrative and character work and how Jacob's Ladder feeds into all that, do you think ultimately it still didn't do enough? It's still whack? It's a technique that should have been pocketed or never been introduced? Or do you agree with me? Do you think that ultimately, yeah, sure, Jacob's Ladder did fumble the bag more times than not, but still, it ended up serving its narrative purpose and doing even more, or at least met its narrative purpose by freeing Satoru Gojo? Please let me know all that and more in the comment section down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, please do me a favor and leave the Angel's Heaven. The Angel's Heaven in the comment section down below. Shout out to my Deltarune fans. But I'd like to thank you so much for watching. Please remember to leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to hit that little notification bell so you don't miss out on any videos that come to the channel. Also, I do have a Patreon down below where you can support me for as low as $1, get them $1. You can exclusive videos, early content, and more. You also now become a member of the channel for as low as $3 a month to get the same perks and more. Some of those perks will include the live reaction to the very next chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen, ad-free variations of all my videos, and if you become a $25 patron or a $25 member, you can order whatever video you want. Also, I do have a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below where you can drop 5 beans for a short video, 20 beans for a long video, or any beans at all. Any support is always greatly appreciated. Now, I'd like to thank you so much for watching once again, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. This is that guy with the pencil, writing off. I'd like to thank you to our $3 members, Zena, Greyhound, Astro, Eternal Flame, NMA, Real Rare, G Prosper, Red Wolf 4765, and Paris Arnold. I'd like to leave another big ol' thank you to our $5 patrons, Sean, Sammy, Midnight Lord 21, Kevin Encarnacion, Josh Brown, and A+A. And I'd like to give a great big thank you to our $7 members, Autumn Mornings Lazo, Fine, and That Guy. And I'd like to give a great big thank you to our $10 members, Robbie Uchiha, Jay Warrior, and Akid's Void. And I'd like to give big, hefty, juicy thank yous to our $10 patrons, Panda Goat, Michael Williamson, Metal Solid Crisis, Joaquin Munoz, and Idem Okami. And I'd like to give the biggest, juiciest, meatiest, sloppiest, and heftiest thank you of them all to our $25 patron, Calvin Elder.